This video was created to explain the current protests and rioting and to give a brief overview of Black discrimination and racism, mostly in America, because some people are unaware of this racism in history or is confused about why people are rioting and protesting, and since we should all educate ourselves before we speak. Today we will be talking about racism. Well, specifically, Black discrimination, because if I discussed every part of racism in history, I would be talking about it until the day I died. Let's start in the mid-13th century. In medieval art, sub-Saharan Africans were depicted as killers and torturers of Jesus Christ and John the Baptist. Now let's get into America. On May 13, 1607, English colonists arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, and on May 14th, the next day, it was founded. Then, on August 20th, 1619, the first Africans were brought to Jamestown, which was a British colony in America. They were kidnapped by the Portuguese and bought by the English. Their names were erased in history, and there is no record of who they were today. The Portuguese captured the African kingdoms of Conga and Ndonga and forced them to march to the port of Luanda and ordered them on a slave ship, the San Juan Bautista, which had 150 to 350 captives who were all Black Africans that died during transportation. The slaves' arrival at Point Comfort was one of the largest trades in the transatlantic slave trade. In the 1500s to the mid-1800s, slave traders transported African slaves to the Americas. And at Point Comfort, 12 million African slaves were transported from Africa in their original homes to the Americas so they could be forced to work for the benefit of white people. There were also white people and Europeans who were forced to work, and they were called indentured servants. They had a choice to work without getting paid. But Africans, on the other hand, had no choice. They were forced into slavery to work. Indentured servants were mostly white Europeans who chose to work out of their own free will and had contracts to work for a certain amount of time, usually 4 to 7 years or longer, depending on if the servant is a child or an adult. A child usually worked more in exchange for transportation or land. Indentured servitude is not the same as slavery. Though both indentured servants and slaves had a contract, had masters, worked in tobacco fields, and endured harsh treatments and conditions, in indentured servitude, there were white people who were servants that had a choice to work, who were allowed to present their own complaints in court, who voluntarily left their homes to work, and had a contract only for a limited time. But in slavery, they were Black slaves who were forced to work and involuntarily were taken from their homes to work and had contracts for a limited time to a lifetime. And if they presented their own complaints or protested, it would lead to their own punishments. In England at the time, a lot of the indentured servants' contracts began to expire, which meant that more African slaves were being held under their contract for life. In 1640, the Virginia court sentenced John Punch for life to slavery. Then a racial caste system developed. In 1662, if an enslaved woman had children, her children would be enslaved by the slave owner as well. And why was slavery necessary? Slavery was necessary for the economy and obtaining resources like tobacco, cotton, and sugar. These cash crops were valuable, and they began to deplete farmland. In Great Britain, textile industries had a high demand for cotton, so Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, which increased the cotton production in the South and also increased slave labor. This machine was built in which slavery was its fuel. In the 18th century, more than 1/3 of the U.S. population were Black slaves, and they've been enslaved for centuries. Though most slaves were afraid of their masters, some just grew tired and they were done, so they began to rebel and plan slave rebellions. One of the most common slave rebellions was Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia, 1831. He and 60 other slaves murdered their masters and their family, killed white groups, and were executed as a result of rebelling. Another slave rebellion was the Stono Rebellion in 1739 at the Stono River Bridge in Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of the bloodiest slave rebellions where 20 slaves broke into a store, stole weapons and supplies, and killed white people before they were caught and executed. And these slave rebellions are like the riots in 2020, where people are risking their lives during a pandemic and risking their lives to get shot. These slaves were risking their lives that they could be executed by their masters, but even knowing the consequences, they didn't care because they're willing to do whatever they can to get the justice that they want. The Stono Rebellion is a perfect example of the rioting and looting that we all see today. Though it may not seem right, both riots in the 17th century and 2020 were a result of anger, because for centuries, they'd been beaten, whipped, killed, treated like animals, hanged to death, and their executions would be legal, celebrated, and would be watched for entertainment. And here's a question for you. Does the white man in this picture look sad? Exactly. Now we get into the abolitionist movement, the movement to end slavery. And when people actually began to realize that slavery was inhumane and unjust. So abolitionists, both black and white people, sent petitions to Congress, and people began writing anti-slavery literature in the South. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was an abolitionist, wrote anti-slavery literature. And one of her books was called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it depicted the harsh conditions of slaves at the time. And Susan B. Anthony believed in freedom and equality for all, including slaves. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave that freed himself, published newspapers to promote the freedom of other slaves. John Brown led raids, one famous one at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And they chose that location specifically because it had a lot of weapons that were stored there. And it was a series of violent uprisings where he and other slaves took weapons and kidnapped slave owners. A slave herself, Harriet Tubman led slaves through the Underground Railroad, which were secret routes and safe houses for slaves to escape. And she led hundreds and thousands of slaves to freedom. There was a whole war that was a fight for slavery. The Civil War, which was a war between the North and South states in the United States. And Abraham Lincoln, who was an abolitionist for the most part, spoke out against slavery, wanted to free the slaves, but he just did not want the South to secede from the Union. He also signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 that freed slaves. But it freed slaves, not all slaves. It did not free slaves in the states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, all states that were legal to the Union. On January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery. And on February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, in which black men could now vote, but not yet women, white or black. After the Civil War, with the Reconstruction or rebuilding of the South, most slaves were free, and former slaves actually had the opportunity to vote, and white people were not okay with this. And maybe if the abolitionists or slaves never protested, maybe none of these acts or amendments would ever be passed. And at this point, you would think, yay, no more slavery. Well, at least most slaves were free at this point, and that black men could now vote. But there is still racism that is always going to be prevalent. especially with the formation of the Ku Klux Klan. On December 24th, 1865, in Pulaski, Tennessee, the KKK was founded, which was a white supremacist group who targeted and murdered African Americans, went on terrorist raids, and destroyed property. The first KKK wizard who co-founded this organization was Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he did try to disband it, but he failed to do so because it got too violent. The KKK also had their revivals in the 10s, 20s, 50s, and 60s, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. And even in the 21st century, they still exist today. The KKK also passed black codes, which suppressed the rights of African Americans to maintain their white supremacy. And then we get into the year 1948. That's when apartheid started, which meant apartness in Afrikaans. It is the law that began racial segregation. It began in South Africa and applied to the non-whites living there. In 1950, the government banned marriage between whites and non-whites, and apartheid also applied in the U.S., which were called Jim Crow laws. And prior to apartheid and Jim Crow laws, in 1896, there was the Plessy versus Ferguson case that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled with its separate but equal doctrine. In the 40s, during World War II, black people were discouraged from joining the military. Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation with separate waiting rooms, fountains, restaurants, stores, schools, public transportation, and bathrooms. Blacks had to give up their seat to white people and sit at the back of the bus. These laws inspired the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s to end legal racial discrimination and segregation. People led violent and nonviolent protests. Malcolm X led violent protests. People performed bus boycotts, and a great example of this would be Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, where she was arrested because she refused to give up her seat to a white man. And people also ran and launched sit-ins. There was one in Greensboro, North Carolina, where 4 black college students refused to leave without being served, inspiring more sit-ins. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education was passed, declaring racial segregation in schools unconstitutional. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine, who were 9 black students in the Central High School, after segregation in public schools was illegal, they received a lot of discrimination, racial slurs, but were escorted by the police for safety through a white mob. In 1960, Ruby Bridges became the first black child to attend and desegregate an all-white school. She was faced with violent mobs and racial slurs. Her dad lost her job, and her family was banned from shopping at the regular grocery store just because she wanted to attend an all-white school. And people at the school despised this little girl so much just because she was black. Let's not forget about the white people who protested against the black people and held up signs saying race mixing is communism. Other civil rights activists were Martin Luther King Jr. He led nonviolent and peaceful protests and marches. He performed his famous I Have a Dream speech, led the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery March, a peaceful protest protesting the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, a black civil rights activist, by a white police officer. George Wallace, an Alabama governor and segregationist, sent the state and local police to stop the protesters. But since they refused, they were beaten and tear-gassed. And here we actually see a historical parallel between George Wallace and President Donald J. Trump. Both Wallace and Trump uttered the words, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Just as George Wallace sent the local and state police after the protesters, in them protesting the killing of Jimmy Lee Jackson, President Trump sent the National Guard after the protesters who protested the killing of George Floyd. And on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. His assassination led to riots and looting all over the country, and it also led to civil rights laws to be passed. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act and Civil Rights Act banned housing discrimination based on sex, race, national origin, and religion. Martin Luther King Jr. was known for ending racial segregation in the South, but racial segregation still remained in South Africa. In 1976, in Soweto, South Africa, Black children protested against requiring Black African students to learn the Afrikaans language. So police fired on them and tear-gassed them. And it wasn't until decades after this that racial segregation was officially banned, which was the year 1994. And now we get into the 21st century, where we still deal with issues like police brutality and Black stereotypes. That they're all crack addicts, drug dealers, criminals, they're poor, they're homeless, or they're all basketball players. Did you know that not all Black people are basketball players? Black people are often falsely accused of crimes more than white people. Crimes like sexual assault, drug cases, and murder. Black people who are not guilty of committing a crime spend 3 years longer than white people who didn't commit a crime. This is because white police are more prevalent in Black neighborhoods, so more crimes committed by Blacks are recorded. Stereotypes and accusations of Blacks that didn't commit a crime can also lead to police brutality. People also try to justify their racism by saying that, well, we had a Black president. But Barack Obama actually received discrimination that people might not be aware of. And before, during, and after his presidential term, there was a lot of anger, sadness, resentment, and discrimination against him. There were birthers, a person who promotes and claims their belief that Obama was not born in the U.S. and isn't eligible to be a president under the Constitution. A good example of a birther would be Donald Trump in 2011, where he claimed that Obama was born in Kenya. So as a response to this, Obama publicly sent out his birth certificate, proving that he was born in the U.S., but Trump still believed it to be fake. And now we get into police brutality. On February 26, 2012, a 17-year-old named Trayvon Martin came out of the store after buying a bag of Skittles and a juice bottle. He had no criminal record, but George Zimmerman, an insurance fraud investigator who was 28 years old, seemed suspicious of him and shot him. He then called the police, but the police didn't arrest him because they said it was an act of self-defense. There were months of protests following Trayvon's death, and George was charged with second-degree murder, but when he went on trial, he was not guilty. And here is a question for you. If a white man who wore that same hoodie and walked out of the same store with the same Skittles and juice bottle, would he have gotten shot? On November 22, 2014, a 12-year-old boy named Tamir Rice, who was holding a fake toy gun, was shot by the Cleveland police. On March 13, 2020, at 12:30 a.m., a 26-year-old woman named Breonna Taylor was shot by the Louisville Metro Police Department while she was asleep with her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. The police entered without knocking but did have a search warrant, and they were there for a drug search. But the person they were targeting was another person who was already detained. On May 25, 2020, a 46-year-old man named George Floyd was held down and suffocated by the Minneapolis Police Department, in which they said that he had a medical condition before a public video of his death was released. And whether or not he had a long criminal record, it does not justify his murder. And the justice for George is not the first and only thing that has happened. There was also justice for Breonna, justice for Travion, justice for Jamel, and other Black people who were victims of police brutality. Many, many others. And the reason why people are going around holding up signs and wearing t-shirts that say justice for George Floyd is because George Floyd was one of the first few evidences of police brutality, and not just to view him as some hero. On June 3rd, 2020, a 35-year-old man named Jamel Floyd was murdered by the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. They were aware of his conditions, that he was asthmatic and diabetic, but they continued to pepper spray him in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center while they broke in. And being pepper sprayed can lead to a high elevation of blood pressure, stroke, heart attack, and even death. And maybe these white people and police officers had bad experiences with Black people, but it does not justify their racism or their murder. Even you. And it's not just white people and cops who try to justify their racism. If you say, well, I have Black friends, or, well, I'm not Black, so it doesn't apply to me, or, well, they had a criminal record, saying those things do not justify your racism either. The protests and riots after the death of George Floyd led to movements like Say Their Names, showing the many Black victims of police brutality, and to prove that it was not just over one man. There was also the I Can't Breathe movement, where on July 17, 2014, Eric Gardner was murdered by the New York Police Department. Both him and George Floyd were held in a chokehold by the police and uttered the words, "I can't breathe," before they were suffocated to death. There were protests against police due to police brutality. There were people wanting to defund the police, cutting budgets of law enforcement agencies and placing them in public housing and health. There was a lot of resentment against the police at the time, because there were police who pretended to kneel with the protesters, but pepper sprayed and or tear gassed them instead. But there were also police who kneeled, cheered, and marched with protesters, and even hugged them. And there were also worldwide protests about the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality in England, Germany, and France. And now we get into systemic racism. Racism that's expressed in social and political institutions, rules, practices, and customs that are set in law. And systemic racism can affect and lead to criminal injustice, unemployment, housing and healthcare discrimination. And a good example of this would be being denied of service just because of your race or ethnicity, even though it is illegal. The unemployment rates of Black Americans are much higher than white Americans. The Black annual income is much lower than the white annual income, and they're more underrepresented in high positions in the government. Now we get into structural racism, which are public policies, institutional practices, and cultural representations that aid in perpetuating racial groups. An example of this is that in the military, they prohibited Black people and African Americans from wearing locks, cornrows, and braids. Next, we will get into something that some people don't believe exists, but it very much does exist. That is white privilege. White privilege is the advantages of white people in education, jobs, wages, retirement, wealth, etc., in history and in the present day. And examples of white privilege would be that white people don't have to experience racism or experience police brutality just because of the color of their skin. They have a higher income and they're more represented in TV shows, movies, and films. A great example of white privilege would be an incident that occurred on May 27th, 2020, where a woman named Amy Cooper was walking her dog off-leash in the New York City Central Park. A black man named Christian Cooper, who was birdwatching, wanted to help her put a leash on her dog. So she called the police, saying that the man was threatening her life. And maybe at the end of this video, you'll think twice about mocking someone who's suffocated to death.
Hi! Is this thing on?
I know it looks pretty nice on camera, but this is actually what it looks like. There's my dog, my fake dog. Stuff is just on this printer. Random messy stuff on the floor. This is what my notes looks like. It was also my script. It's very, very messy. Yep. This is my very messy desk as a result from having to take a lot of the stuff down from my closet to make room for all the little history posters. I ghettoly had to tape this Declaration of Independence. So yeah, and this little ink thing is literally an eyeshadow thing. And it was used as an ink. And a little fake feather pen right here. Ooh.